Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Krista Costas Bradstreet. I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships for the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association, or CPRA. We are thrilled to welcome you today to discuss intersectionality and sociocultural barriers to engaging and retaining girls, women, and non-binary people. Before we get started, I just want to give you a brief introduction to CPRA, which is a national organization dedicated to realizing the full potential of parks and recreation as a major contributor to community health and vibrancy. Over its 60-year history, CPRA has been the national voice for parks and recreation, advancing the collective interests of our members. CPRA is a national network dedicated to the well-being of people, communities, and the natural and built environments. And CPRA provides services for our members and partners that cultivate dialogue, learning, and innovation. CPRA's strength comes from the experience, expertise, and network of the staff and board members from our membership, which is the 13 provincial and territorial associations. We also work with volunteers, government partners, and a number of allied sectors such as physical activity, sport, education, public health, and others that help us make progress on our goals, and we strive to help them meet theirs. We have a virtual office with between 5 and 7 staff, depending on our projects. And as the national office of CPRA is located in Ottawa, I pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. I acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. I pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. The other thing I just want to mention to you is over the past several months, as you know, we have been challenged with COVID-19. And CPRA has tried to be very proactive dealing with the COVID-19 crisis in the Recreation Centre. We have held weekly calls with our PT members to provide regional updates and identify the needs of the sector. We have been monitoring, updating, and providing guidance on federal government aid programs. We've been actively advocating to the federal government for financial support for the sector, both in the immediate phase and as we look to a recovery phase. We work with national partners to make sure that we're aligning our efforts and our messaging. We've been sharing information and ideas on social media, and we've been providing a number of tools to support the sector. We hosted 6 webinars on reopening facilities, and those are all available to you on the CPRA website. We've also launched something new called The Bench. It is a resource that initially began to support the efforts for COVID-19, but it now has expanded to also providing information on events, discussion groups, the Framework for Recreation in Canada, Parks for All, and a number of other resources that we will be adding in the future. So we really encourage you to check out The Bench. And I'd like to just play you briefly a video that describes a little more of its function. Today's webinar is part of CPRA's Gender Equity and Recreational Sport Initiative. In November 2019, CPRA was awarded a contract from the Government of Canada to increase the participation and retention of women and girls in recreational sport. We have 4 priority populations: girls aged 9 to 15 years, mothers, postnatal, and those with school-aged children, women 55 and over, and girls and women with intersecting identity factors. Throughout this project, there are a number of pieces that CPRA will design and deliver, including toolkits, workshops, webinars, some high-five training, and community grant programs. Specifically, CPRA is relaunching its Community Grants Initiative. In 2020, we actually supported 52 projects across Canada, and we have just announced this week on The Bench CPRA's next call for funding. So for more information, you can see the two links on the screen, and we invite you to take a look at the information there. And we want to just make a note that for 2021, we're encouraging applicants to be really creative in the context of COVID-19. Just want to mention again, this project supports the Government of Canada, specifically Sport Canada's funding commitment to achieve gender equity in sport at every level by 2035. So with that, I want to now welcome you again to the webinar, and I want to introduce Janelle Joseph, who's going to facilitate today's session for us. Dr. Joseph is an assistant professor of critical race studies at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. Dr. Joseph is an internationally recognized and award-winning scholar committed to disseminating knowledge about race and physical cultures. She is the founder and director of the Ideas Lab, focusing on issues of indigeneity, diaspora, equity, and anti-racism in sport. So thank you, Janelle, for your commitment to CPRA and to this topic today, and I look forward to the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am a critical race theorist, and what that means is I take as my foundational premise that racism is a foundational structuring feature of our society. And so in Canada, that means that our laws, our healthcare system, our education system, and of course, our sport and recreation systems are built on these colonial principles. So the foundation of colonialism is a hierarchical system, and that system puts able-bodied people over disabled, men over women, and whites over Blacks, people who identify as Indigenous, and people of color. Another foundational aspect of critical race theory is the belief that we need to listen to the voices of those who are most marginalized in our society to understand what we have to do to fix some of these broken structures. Those who are on the margins have been talking for a long time, so we really need to listen. And what they've been saying is that their experiences of oppression are systemic and intersectional. And it's this idea of intersectionality that we're gathered here today to speak about. What I've learned through my research with racialized Canadians is that we can't only focus on issues of race if we want to solve problems of social injustice. The research that I've done on recreational spaces and older Caribbean Canadians really drew my attention to leisure studies and specifically the sport of cricket. What I found was that men who played cricket identified as Black, some as Indian, and some as Canadian. They identified as fathers and grandfathers, in some cases living with a disability or a temporary injury, or as former police officers, or those who had experienced profiling and brutality by police. They had wives and daughters who were included in the cricket celebrations, especially in the cooking, the eating, and the dancing after the games, but they were excluded from play because there was no women's league. In other words, their Blackness was complicated, and taking only a racial analysis would have been insufficient to understand their experiences. And this is why I turned to intersectionality theory. All of us on this panel today think that intersectionality is a core concept and that it will be useful for you in your work to understand how you can improve inclusion practices and policies. So I want to spend a bit of time unpacking this idea of intersectionality so that you understand where it comes from and how it might be useful for you. Intersectionality theory concentrates on the idea that all of us have multiple identities. And for some of us who are experiencing oppressions, exclusion, or injustice, it's not possible to think of those identities as distinct from each other. They're overlapping, they're interlocking, or as Black feminist legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw named in 1989, they are intersectional. So she uses this foundational case, an example of a legal case with a Black woman who was experiencing employment discrimination. So in the eyes of the law, Black women were unable to prove that the employer had discriminated against Blacks because Black men were being hired and in some cases promoted. They were unable to prove that women were being discriminated against because white women were being hired and promoted. And so when they stood at the intersection, if you really think about two roads meeting, the race road and the gender road, when they are at that intersection and they are experiencing exclusions, just thinking about the roads didn't help them. It wasn't just a race issue and it wasn't just a gender issue. We really need to think about the simultaneity, the compounding of the discrimination that they were experiencing. And we know that people have many identities other than just race and gender. And so for that reason, they might experience many different kinds of discrimination or oppressions. So if people are living with a disability or are visibly religious or living outside a gender binary or caregiving for others, and I could go on, we understand that adding up these identity categories or adding up these numbers of roads is not going to help us. It does not move us towards inclusion. We can't just keep adding different types of people. We have to think about the systems of exclusion that are based on these colonial histories and traditions, particularly within sport, recreation, and fields of related to leisure. When we consider the oppressions and privileges are not the same everywhere at all times, this also complicates our understandings of identities and systemic discriminations because all of us are shifting dynamically depending on the settings that we're in. As a Black cisgendered female professor, I hold a lot of power, especially when I'm talking to my students or when I'm invited to start a panel such as this. When I speak, you listen. But I can guarantee you there are many settings that I am in where I feel ignored, I feel silenced, and I don't have the power. For example, with the cricket research, I was able to enter as a dancer, as a cook, as a researcher actually, but I wasn't invited to be a player. And so there are many of us that are constantly fighting uphill battles, depending on the kinds of identities that we hold. In my heart, I'm a dancer and a martial artist. And there have been many environments that I have tried to enter in order to express myself. And the kinds of activities that I wanted to participate were not available to me. And so for me, what I did was start those organizations, start that dance club, bring my friends in and say, we can do this martial art in this space, even though it's not offered on the roster of programming. But how much work do the marginalized folks need to do to create these opportunities for themselves? We want this to come from the dominant organizations. So when we're thinking of our inclusion efforts, we have to account for the heterogeneous and dynamic nature of identities, the way they are shifting between spaces. And the liberal approach that we often take to inclusion, it usually involves making assumptions about who people are and what they need. For example, not all Muslim women wear hijab or need women's only physical activity spaces or experience anti-Black racism, but some of them do. And there's so many different aspects of identity that we might not initially be able to see, such as your accent or your profession or being a survivor of trauma or your generation of immigration, athlete status, visible or invisible religious status, or neurodiversity. All of these factors will influence how space is or could be used. So when we're thinking about intersectionality, if your tendency is to focus on those people over there, those people with intersections, I want you to pause. I think we do this for a couple of reasons. First, the work environments that many of us are in, they're not as diverse as the Canadian population. And please note, when I say diverse, I'm not just thinking about race and culture, but that is certainly part of it. Every one of us are reflecting on our own personal, family, and community experiences when we do our work. We bring those experiences into our planning processes. And so if our staff teams are not diverse in terms of multiple language speakers, in terms of gender presentations, et cetera, then, and if staff are not empowered to share what their backgrounds are, and they end up hiding some of their experiences that don't match this dominant system, then we won't be able to include or create more expansive and inclusive programming. In addition to not having diverse teams, another reason why we focus on those intersectional people over there is that many of us are afraid to look in the mirror, to examine our own privileges and the colonial histories of the systems that we perpetuate. Our parks and rec systems were not created haphazardly, right? They were built on exclusions. And we've had to fight for girls hockey, fight for adapted sports, fight for inclusive spaces. And so instead of looking over there and asking those people what they need, we need to examine the systems that we have participated in, that we have created, and think about how our privileges have allowed that to feel normal, to feel safe, and think about how we might do things differently. In specific terms, what I mean is rather than focusing on the experiences of, for example, Black and Indigenous peoples and exploring how racism and disenfranchisement and exclusion has affected them, we should look at white privilege as the problem that we need to fix. And when sport administrators have the ability to see sport as accessible, or they don't take other people's existence into account, it makes some people invisible. And I mean seeing it as accessible when really it's not. Some people can't be seen because they're not there. And so we have one route, which is to ask them what they need. But I think we're past the point where marginalized people have been telling us what they need. And so we need to listen, read, figure out what we can do, reflect on our systems, and do things differently. We're really thankful to have this opportunity to talk to you today at this critical point of history, because we know that there are so many good equity-seeking, equity-minded folks who are asking, what don't I know? What do I need to know to do things differently? I'm ready. And so we're happy to have this conversation today and to share with you an intersectional framework, intersectional theory and thinking about policy and practices and what changes might be useful. I feel really privileged to be on this screen with some people that I know have had deep experiences within sport, within parks and recreation. And so I don't want to take up any more time. I want to turn it over to them and listen to what it is that they have to say to share their expertise on intersectionality with us today. So I'll start with a broad question because I know that all of our past experiences bring us to the point where we are today. And so whether it's because of your work or your research or your play or your family, you have ended up in a position where intersectionality is important to you. So I'll start with you, Danielle, if you wouldn't mind. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and your experiences and how that has informed your understanding of intersectionality?
Thank you, Janelle. My name is Danielle Piers. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a queer, non-binary, disabled artist, filmmaker, dancer, researcher, ex-coach, ex-Paralympian. I wear a lot of hats. I'm also a settler on Treaty 6 territory. I was born in what is now called Edmonton, Alberta, and I take that role very seriously in terms of someone who's signed to a treaty that is often ignored and weaponized against people whose rights are undermined constantly in this country. I'm also a Canada Research Chair in Disability Movement Cultures, and I'm an assistant professor in the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation. So what I really focus on is a whole range of ways that people engage in cultures that are meaningful for them through movement. So that could be sport, it could be art, it could be leisure, it could be backcountry hiking, or it could be Paralympic sport. So this whole sort of range, and I try and take an intersectional lens to that. My own personal experience around intersectionality, I think, is a good demonstration of how this can kind of work within a sports system. So I was a Paralympic athlete. I played on the national team, and I also played in professional men's league because there was no professional women's league in Europe. Interestingly, I have an impairment that sport was not designed for. So 2/3 of disabled people in Canada experience more than one form of impairment. But all of our parasports are designed around having one single impairment, and it's often impairments that are designed to be around folks, well, white men coming back from war getting injured was how most of the sports were designed. So those of us who experience more than one form of impairment or don't have an acquired injury are kind of trying to fit our bodies into this sort of classification and rule system where we were never really ever designed to be in the first place. So although I had a lot of success in sport, I had to do it at the cost of leaving a big part of myself at the door. And that includes my queerness, my gender queerness, and my illness. Many parts of my disability, including my respiratory issues, there was no way for it to fit within a Paralympic context. And that pretty much blew up 4 years into being on the national team and ended up being literally life-threatening in terms of the costs for me. And I will say that then you're like, oh, well, if you can't play parasport, well, you're queer, so you can play outsport, you can play gay sport. There's all these sort of beautiful recreational things that you can do now that are designed around that locally as well as nationally and internationally. And not a single one of those that I've ever encountered in my local region or in competitive national or international are wheelchair accessible. So I can't access a single queer out gay sporting or recreational event that I've ever encountered. So you have the situation where, like intersectionality, you imagine, oh, that's great, you can play at all the parties, but actually it sets up in a way that actually you can't access any of the systems that are designed in order to support people who are excluded.
Thank you for sharing that. I think we don't often take into account the costs of these kinds of things. And in your case, it was literally life-threatening. So thank you for sharing that. Tricia, could I go to you next? Can you tell us about your involvement in sport and recreation and how that's related to the kinds of work that you do?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to say, Miigwech, thank you for the kind invitation to speak today. I'm honored to be presenting with all the folks on the panel today as your work continues to inspire me. So I'm an Anishinaabe woman from Bingwe-Niashi Anishinaabeg in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is in Robinson Superior Treaty Territory. And I now live and work in unceded Algonquin Anishinaabeg Territory, which is now called Ottawa. And I'm an assistant professor with the Faculty of Education at the University of Ottawa. And I'm also a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Ganondasawin Good Health Sovereignties. And so I come to this work both from a personal place of learning about my embodied physical strength through kettlebells. And I have been a certified kettlebell coach since 2008. Prior to my certification as a kettlebell coach, my life partner, Ryan, he completed his master's degree on a program called For Vitality Kettlebell Training Program. And it was through his understanding of kettlebells that really created a family environment where we both became certified kettlebell instructors. And when we started practicing not only our own personal embodiment of physical strength through kettlebells, we invited our community to also participate. And our community at the time, when we began living in Ottawa, was the urban Indigenous community. And we volunteered with the Odawa Native Friendship Center here in Ottawa. And we still volunteer with them. And it's been ongoing since 2008. And it was this volunteer capacity where we were giving back our skills as kettlebell instructors to urban Indigenous folks, who include women, men, youth, older adults, and people who live with disabilities came to our program. And it was in that space where I was able to participate in fostering a community that was based upon physical regeneration. And this community of support came through. So it wasn't just about physical activity. It was about us showing up for each other, listening to each other. And oftentimes what happened is we would show up to our community and participate in our physical activity, but it would also become a safe space upon which we could talk about our intersectional identities or the harms that we were experiencing in our everyday lives. And so it really became a melding of the two, where we would couple physical activity with these critical dialogues in a really safe and supportive environment. And it just allowed us to feel regenerated amongst each other. So that deeply personal experience then allowed me to foster a program of research since 2013, which is still ongoing, regarding an Anishinaabe term called Wissakotatawin. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into the questions. But Wissakotatawin means gathering together for a purpose. And I wanted to better understand how this intentful coming together based within an Anishinaabe worldview and perspective really helps to foster this personal decolonization through physical activity and foster physical regeneration through our embodiments. So that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you so much, Tricia. Thanks for highlighting these different dimensions of health, all of which are, brought together through the focus point of physical activity, but there's so much more to it. So I really appreciate that. Okay, and Donnie, over to you. Tell us about your involvement in sport and recreation, and how is this related to the kinds of work that you do now?
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. And I'd like to start by saying thank you, Danielle and Tricia. Being on the screen with the three of you is probably one of the highlights of my sporting career and my policy making. So I know that after this, I hope to keep in touch with all of you so that I can continue my learning journey. I am Donnie Rosa. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I am the general manager of the Board of Parks and Recreation in Vancouver, and we are on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I should start by saying that the values that I bring, I think, have to be aligned with our Indigenous community. And I'm so thrilled to be working in a place where those are values that we entrench, not just as a city of reconciliation, but as a park board. And so this is really near and dear to my heart. I have over 25 years experience in parks and recreation, probably closer to 30 years, but who's counting? I'm the president-elect for BC Parks and Rec Association, as well as a board member for CPRA. In the last 15 years, I've really had the opportunity to focus on influencing policy. And I think that has been the most meaningful part of my journey. What brings me to this personally is I guess I grew up in a family of where sport and recreation was an outlet for all of my siblings and myself. And for my parents, it was a place to keep us out of trouble. Um, in the mid 70s, I wanted to play lacrosse just like my brothers, box lacrosse. And there was no place for someone my age and a female to play. So my parents just named me Donnie. That's when I lost the name Donna Lynn and I became Donnie. And they just signed me up in the boys league. So for that summer, I just got to be a little boy. And my parents kept saying, you have to act like a little boy. And I just was myself and fit in beautifully. So it was an interesting summer. And beyond that, I got to continue to play. And at that time, girls weren't allowed to play with boys. We hadn't had the court cases that allowed that to open up. I went on to play NCAA hockey in the United States, in Boston. And at that time, Title IX had just been introduced. And that was Title IX is so that you invest the same in men's as women's. So we didn't have a huge investment in women's hockey. The women's hockey team went undefeated that year. And the men's football team lost their 12th game in a row and still made the front page while we were buried on the back page of the school newspaper. So possibly those things were a call to action for me in that getting into sport and recreation, I had always realized that folks considered us second-class citizens. And to put on top of that, that I, as a queer woman in sport, at a young age, there was no coming out. There was no comfortable space. So every team I played on, I was the first one generally to just come out and then, people would follow. And what I found was there was strength in that. And so I bring that into my policy making. I bring that into my leadership. I bring it into actually, as you do, into everything that I do. So I'm thrilled that we're having this conversation. I'm thrilled that this is on a national platform. And I'm really excited about what we can do with this and where we go from here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Donnie. You're emphasizing for me the fight, the legal battles, and I don't think it should be lost on us that this idea of critical race theory and intersectionality comes out of critical legal studies. And so we're talking about human rights here. This idea of inclusion is really about basic human rights. So thank you so much for that. I'll reverse the order for the next question. I wonder if, Donnie, you might, if you wouldn't mind starting. I'm interested to know what sport and recreation inclusion efforts have done. So we know that there have been many attempts to fix the disparities among girls and women and non-binary people and others in sport. So can you tell us why are we still having this conversation? Why are these inclusion efforts unsuccessful?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And when I reflect back of 25 years, I was having this conversation 25 years ago, and that is frustrating. And I feel a little bit a lot responsible as well, but I also look at the successes and I feel proud of those. So I think that there was a notion that if we offer a girls program, or if we offer a Muslim swim, a Muslim ladies swim, check, we've done our part. And we didn't dive deeper. And we didn't look to include everybody in the decision making and the planning. So we always looked at it within Parks and Rec as, if we had a program, we were doing our part. And it wasn't until lawsuits started to come about where folks started to have to really, truly examine and go deeper and go into your policy and go into your practice and go into really your culture. And so that work is being done. We're not there yet. That's why we're here. But it has started. So I think that one of the reasons that it never worked was that there was no impetus, there was no pressure, there was no voice, there's no calling. And so fortunately, the legal action has pushed us there. In environments where we're going to create spaces where people are feeling welcome, we can't, as recreation service providers from our lived experiences, go forth and provide solutions and programs. It has to be an inclusive action. It has to be something that we do together. So I'm hoping, I know that later on we'll get into hopefully a little bit about what does work, but definitely if you look at what doesn't work, then you come out with, how you can get to what does work.
Thanks, Donnie. And Tricia, over to you. Why are some of the inclusion efforts unsuccessful?
I come at this important question from an understanding of deficit narratives. Oftentimes, what happens when we think about Indigenous folks' participation in sport, or if we're looking at Indigenous folks' health and well-being across a broad spectrum, it's often positioned within a deficit narrative that Indigenous peoples suffer greater chronic health compared to non-Indigenous people, that we don't participate in sport at the same level as non-Indigenous people. And so inherently built into the conversations about policy, about programs, is this deficit narrative. Indigenous folks don't view ourselves in a deficit narrative. We very much come to our physical activity from a strength and empowered based perspective. I embody physical strength that's at one time connected to my ancestors, it's connected through me, and it's connected to my future generations. And so when I come at it from an Anishinaabe understanding of physical activity, it's very much coming from a non-deficit perspective. It's important to understand how this deficit narrative is used very particularly almost in a way that's invisible, because there is this underlying notion, and Janelle, you did such an amazing job at contextualizing how settler colonialism is part of all of these discussions. And so the health deficit narratives also serves this purpose, where there's this underlying assumption or this underlying myth that Indigenous peoples are always meant to disappear, whether that be through ill health, whether that be through other chronic conditions, we're always meant to disappear. So when we Indigenous folks show up to our own physical activity spaces, coming from an empowered place, coming from a place that's informed from our ancestral teachings about being physically active, for instance, that completely challenges that deficit narrative. No, we are not being erased. We're here, we're thriving, and we're strong. So that's my understanding of some of the issues regarding current policies and practices that aren't necessarily working, is that we need to do a better job at really challenging those deficit narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. When, as Donnie was mentioning, the Muslim women box, when we think of the Indigenous girls and women non-binary two-spirit box, if we're not talking about ancestral teachings, if we're not talking about 7 generations in the future, what are we doing, right? So it's an understanding of Indigenous knowledge systems that will help you to include Indigenous girls, women, non-binary, and two-spirit folks.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that. Danielle, I'll ask you if you wouldn't mind giving us some examples of some of the successes and what has been done to change these existing structures to be more inclusive and to be more aware of the intersectional barriers.
Yeah, one example I have is we were working towards just trying to get essentially bathrooms that would be safe for non-binary and trans people to use on campus in the University of Alberta. And that includes in my building, kinesiology, where we have a lot of people coming from the community to participate in anything from swimming to rock climbing to all the kids that come through for track and field. And in the past, a number of trans activists had fought for this and had been basically shut down at every single possible level. And what had been happened is that other folks who were marginalized were used against them, right? They didn't ask us, but they're like, oh no, if you take over the single stalls, then what about the disabled people, right? And as often happens in sort of any kind of homophobia, is we practice homophobia by practicing Islamophobia, by assuming a particular kind of cultural idea about who wouldn't feel safe in those spaces. And so when we came across this problem, instead, we came forward with the idea of are the current bathrooms and change rooms not working for? So instead of thinking about kinds of people, we thought about kinds of barriers. And so we gathered a whole bunch of people, lots of folks who had deeply intersectional experience, including queer Muslim feminists, including people with kids, including disabled non-binary people, including like this whole range of folks. What we found is that non-binary and trans people didn't feel safe in gendered washrooms. We found that disabled folks, there weren't enough single-use washrooms or accessible washrooms that were near to them. And of course, it often takes a lot more energy for us to get across campus to use one. That disabled folks who require support, so any kind of support to toilet, that is actually extremely helpful to be able to have anyone support, not just someone of the same gender. That people with children would find it massively easier to be in a space where they didn't have to negotiate cross-gender parenting. We found that folks who are overly surveilled, including the Muslim Women's Association talked about this, including folks who dealt with fat phobia, racism, gender surveillance, other kinds of religious surveillance, and that all those folks also wanted to change in washrooms. And so we actually started with the idea of what kinds of washroom systems and change room systems would serve all these folks who it's not currently serving. And it was, to use a bad sport metaphor for someone who does in a wheelchair, a slam dunk. So it's an idea about really thinking about the kinds of barriers as opposed to kinds of people and thinking transformationally instead of incrementally.
Thank you so much. I'll just echo that because it's something that I've heard you say before, and I've really taken it to heart in my research and practice and teaching. It's not about kinds of people. We're thinking about kinds of barriers and systems that need changing. Thank you so much for that. Donnie, could I go to you with the same question? Could you tell us about what's being done to change these existing structures and to be more aware of intersectional barriers?
Yeah. And I love that you talk about approaching this from removing barriers. You've heard this, I'm sure, and what's essential for one is good for all. And so at the Park Board, we've really taken the approach that I think really helpful. We don't know everything. So first we put that out there. Second, we figure out who can we work with, who can we bring onto our staff, who can help us to better understand, and who can connect with community or can work to remove barriers. So first off, the Park Board was the first municipal Parks and Rec in Canada to hire an archaeologist. And this archaeologist's simple role was to make sure we did not disturb Indigenous spaces, that we respected our Indigenous community, and that we were essentially building a relationship around the earth, the ground. Policy is one thing, but the earth is so important. We obviously have a mandate for truth and reconciliation. We have Indigenous planners within the city of Vancouver and at the Park Board. And the Park Board's Indigenous planners' role is to decolonize our practices. So it's not about this, we're trying to go to the root. The other thing that we did, and I think that in order to be successful, you have to be brave and bold, and you have to lead the way. And I'm thrilled to be with the Park Board because I feel like we have the opportunity to do that. So a couple of years ago, we realized that one of the barriers for the trans and the trans community was that we didn't know what programming or what barriers existed. So you've all heard nothing about us without us. So we applied that thinking, and we went to the Human Rights Commission to earn the right to hire 2 trans facilitators. We got some pushback from some folks south of the border, but in Canada here and in Vancouver, everybody was pretty much supportive of us hiring 2 trans facilitators whose job is to communicate with the trans community, to reach out, to figure out what is it that's stopping you from using our facilities. And like Danielle said, it was very similar things that were stopping other people. So it was actually, it has been very enlightening in that it's like, oh, we can do that. We just didn't know that that was what we needed to do. So by working with folks of the community, we're able to get to the root of it. And then we're able to tackle policy. And I think that policy for me is the biggest thing, that if we can tackle policy and make sure that once we leave, the people who come into our place have that policy in place that allows them to continue the work, but also mandates them to continue this work.
Thank you, Donnie. This idea of what in the legal framework is called positive discrimination or targeted hiring is something I think that comes up a lot. And I think it's something that makes those who are very comfortable in the system uncomfortable because it unsettles them and it really shines a light on, who is at your staff meetings. When you look around now, it's looking around the screen. But when in the old days, when you looked around the table, who was there, what did their bodies represent, and who was missing. And targeted hiring, focused positive discrimination in order to redress historical injustices is allowed. There is a system, you might get some pushback, you need to navigate that system, but if it's important to you and your organization, then you can do it. You can create a job posting that says we're looking for X. And making that inclusion deep, bringing someone onto your staff, and actually, one thing that you mentioned, bringing 2 people on. The research has actually shown that 2 or 3 people is the core that you need to do a cluster hire so that people can feel supported when they arrive and so they're not the only one, so they don't get tokenized. Then that's how we can make real change, is that we're doing it from within. We're not just going out and asking those people over there just one afternoon and giving them a pizza voucher. We're actually bringing people into our organizations to make that change from within. Thank you so much for those examples. Did you want to add something else, Donnie?
No, well, I just wanted to say that the beauty of that is that these folks have been set up to then go on to work within our system. They learn our system and go on and work. And if you can make that happen, being brave and bold actually gets easier over time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then their role does not have to be related specifically to their identity. They can be part of the organization like everyone else. Thank you so much. All right, and Trisha, are we on to you next? Can you tell us about some specific examples of successes?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and for success for me, it really means a deepening of a regeneration of Indigenous understandings, both linguistically and also practices of physical activity, but also what are for my own communities, what are Anishinaabe understandings of health and well-being, and how can we recenter those understandings in our practices regarding physical activity or in our practices regarding policy? And so, for instance, in my own research, how I came about this is I started to speak with those of my friends in my community who had a really deep understanding of our Anishinaabe language, our Anishinaabe language, because I'm not fluent in my language. Both of my grandparents were survivors of residential school and did not pass on our Anishinaabe language. And so I turned to friends and family who still have an understanding. And so I wanted to understand from our perspectives, from our theoretical but also practical engagements, how we can recenter our rationale for being physically active and being health and engaging in health and well-being. And key concepts emerged from our own linguistic understandings. For instance, Gwese Jitadun and Dobama Dizawin, which means transforming oneself into a better life. And we do this when we connect to our personal decolonization processes regarding health and well-being. Every single person who now lives in what we now know as Canada is impacted deeply by settler colonialism and the history and ongoing presence of it. And in order to disrupt that, and a powerful way to do that is to decenter whiteness and recenter or think about how we can embody Indigenous understandings of health and well-being. And Gwese Jitadun and Dobama Dizawin is a very powerful testament of how to do that. So broadly speaking, that concept understands how we have been affected by ill health. We have been affected by forced removal from our territories, from our governance practices, but it's also allowing us to think about how we can regenerate those practices through our physical activity, through our physicality. Again, remembering those ancestral practices of being on the land, going out on the land and having that engagement on our territories. And these activities are demonstrable acts of regeneration. And so that's my perspective in terms of understanding how we can engage in a deep recentering or deep change, deep systems change. It's just looking to and being informed by, in a very respectful and humble way, Indigenous understandings of the world.
Thank you. And knowing that these practices are happening, right?
Yeah.
I think some people think that they have to invent it out of nowhere. Like, what will we do for these people? How could we possibly be more inclusive? And it is happening in many different communities. So yes, absolutely. Being humble, listening, going in, and as Donnie was just mentioning, bringing people in so that they can transform from within is so important. And I really feel privileged that this conversation is happening at a national level today. You know, the Canada Parks and Rec has so much power and so many opportunities to do transformational work. And so this idea of resurgence, of regeneration that we can take from our Indigenous ancestors and our current elders, I think could make transformative change across the nation. So thank you for bringing that to us, Tricia. We're running out of time. I can't believe this. I would love to hear from each of you your top 3 recommendations for Canada Parks and Rec. What can be done to better support intersectional inclusion in sport and recreation? And you'll remember that our original question was about girls, women, and non-binary people. And what we've done is transform that question into every person, because we know that the things that will help girls, women, and non-binary folks, however they are defined, they have many different identities, and what is good for them will be good for our broader communities. So Danielle, could I start with you? Top 3 recommendations.
So I'm going to repeat the idea that you want to focus on kinds of barriers as opposed to kinds of people, but not only in our problem solving, but importantly in our communications. So the 20 times I go to try and do something that's recreational, 19 and a half I get rejected, or there's something that's a barrier for me. So actually being very explicit about the barriers that you are removing, the barriers you are still working on, and the barriers you haven't yet tackled makes it safer for some to actually realize that they will be affirmed in that space and what they will face when they go there. So being very clear about that on your websites, on your organizations. Center the experience of those who face multiple significant barriers. And we tend to be trickle down, so we get the easiest case for a court, and that's where we do our law-based. Instead, we want to do the opposite. We want to get people who are most impacted by the most barriers. That's the best way to diagnose what could be changed in the system. And the third one is when disability or other people like us who haven't been imagined within a system show up, we disrupt it, and we're understood as disruptive. And accommodations are often designed to enable someone to enter with the least amount of disruption. And I would say lean into disruption. These are opportunities that we can learn how to disrupt colonial, sexist, misogynist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, fatphobic, Islamophobic systems, is allowing people to disrupt those and really celebrating and affirming that.
Thank you for that. This inclusion conversation needs to not think of the status quo, including others, but we are changing the way that we do business. So thank you for that. Donnie, over to you. Top 3 recommendations?
Oh, 3, eh? Thank you, Danielle. I love that. Lean in, or I'm going to invite disruption and be that too. I'm going to go to policy because that's where I come from. I think there are so many tools out there, like like you both, Danielle and Janelle, have said, and I think Tricia spoke to it. Evaluate your own policy, but look for tools like there's GBA, Gender-Based Analysis Plus tool. There's, at the City of Vancouver, we have the Anti-Racism Equity Decision-Making tool. These are lenses that are built for municipal service provider as well as others. But specifically, if you're looking for your municipal service policy, look to other municipalities who have done this work and then, take that. I think it's important to include men in the process, specifically when we're talking about women and equity. They need to be on board with this as well. And I think that I'm going to go with the nothing without us, nothing about us without us. Um, to go back to that, it's just so important that we don't think that we, as the service providers, know everything. So engage the folks who do. So I'll finish with be brave in your actions and be bold.
Thank you. And that takes a bit of risk, right? It's one thing to say be brave, but you have to be ready to encounter that pushback and stand in the face of your decision. So that's so great. Thank you, Donnie. Okay, Trisha, over to you. Top 3 recommendations.
Sure, thanks. And I think they're all kind of interweaved together. But my first recommendation would be to learn about and instill a community-driven approach to program development through developing meaningful relationships with those whom you want to invite in, and to provide funding to support those well-being practices through physical activity and through sport. And all of this should be informed from, and more importantly, led by those quote unquote folks who operate in from the quote unquote margins. And to invite all people, but in particular, when we're thinking about girls, women, and non binary people, invite them in to start creating these programs. It's not about doing something for them. It's about creating inclusive spaces where they can feel safe to share their perspectives about how to develop such physical activity and sport programs that are attentive to their desires and to their wants. And the last thing is to invite robust and uncomfortable conversations about white supremacy, racism, ableism, and how they are implicated in policy and programs. Learn about key concepts and issues we deal with: anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, settler colonialism, decolonization and regeneration movements. Really learn about what those things mean and personalize it for yourself. How can you create demonstrable actions towards challenging and disrupting those systems? And this is hard work, but it is necessary work for all of us. It's not just our responsibilities from those folks who speak from the margins. It's all of our responsibility to make this change. And if we can each connect to that driving force, then I firmly believe we can make those societal changes.
And the change is happening. And that's one thing that really warms my heart. As much as I look back on Black feminists writing from the early 1900s through the middle of the 20th century, and the same themes are repeated, we know that we are always in a moment of change, right? And so there's the historical legacies and the pernicious injustices of colonialism that we're all living with all the time, even today. And I'm so thankful that I'm here in a time when, we can have these conversations at a national level. And, not everyone has the language or the vocabulary or the actions yet, but we're building it together. And I really feel fortunate for this opportunity. I'm sad to say goodbye, but I am so happy that we've had this opportunity to chat today. And I do want to give some time for the audience to ask some questions. So I think we'll end here and turn it over to the audience.
Well, thank you so much to our panel for an amazing conversation and discussion today. I will have a chance to thank you again at the end, but for now, you can see we're back live. And so I am going to turn it back over to Dr. Joseph to facilitate our question and answer portion of the webinar. I would just want to remind everyone that you have an opportunity to ask questions by clicking on the chat box, and Dr. Joseph will go through your questions. And I see that we actually have a few coming in, so hopefully you can see those okay, Janelle, and we can give you a hand if you're having any trouble with the chat box. But in the meantime, I will turn it over to you and to our panel, and just come back at the very end. Thanks.
All right. Thank you all so much. And yes, if you don't mind giving me a hand with the chat, I think sometimes it's hard to manage both. So if there are some questions that I missed, please don't hesitate to jump in, Krista. But one of the things that we really wanted to take this opportunity to reinforce is that when we're thinking intersectionally, we need to really understand understand who our communities are. And so thinking about how we could understand them in order to include them, how we could make sure that our staff reflect who the community are. That is a starting point, is understanding who we are serving. Um, One of the questions is gathering together for a purpose. And I guess the question from Tasha McKenna is, what is the Indigenous term? So maybe Tricia, if you wouldn't mind repeating that to clarify um, what that term is.
Sure, yeah, the term is an Anishinaabe term, and it's called Wiso Kotata Win. And this phrase and this term was taught to me by my connections to community elders in the community of Nakatchewanong First Nation, which is in Treaty 3 territory. I've had a long-standing relationship with the community, and I feel so grateful to be able to learn about Anishinaabe language and our concepts through my relationships with the elders there.
Thank you, Tricia. And so if we're going to think about how we might incorporate this into our work, we did end the seminar thinking about, 3 action steps. If someone wanted to know where to start, what would be one thing that you might recommend as a starting place? And so I've already mentioned, knowing who our communities are and thinking about your staff complement. Is there anything else that any of the panelists might offer as a starting place?
I'm happy to jump in with that. I think that one of the best places to start is to, first of all, look around the table at the meetings you're at. And I think someone said that, who's missing? Also, go out and take a look at who you're seeing in your parks, who you're seeing in your community, who you're seeing in your community centers, and then look at your staff and see how well those folks are reflected, or that we're reflecting our community. There's also, there's demographics, there's things like that. But what you'll find is there's more answers in who's not there than who's there in using your spaces. And so then you need to start to ask yourself, why? What's my blind spot? What do I not know that's preventing somebody from being in this space with us?
Thanks for that, Donnie. And when Danielle was speaking at the end of the seminar, you mentioned a few different recommendations in terms of the barriers. So not focusing on kinds of people, but kinds of barriers. And you were specifying barriers in communication. Would you mind just highlighting those again in terms of how organizations can clarify the access points?
Yes, for sure. Thank you for that. So not only are we thinking about barriers instead of kinds of people in terms of why people aren't there, but we're also thinking one of the big things that makes a big difference for those of us who are used to showing up in spaces where we aren't included, where we can't get in, is being very explicit about the kinds of things your organization has done to remove barriers. So rather than saying, we invite all LGBTQ people to be here, it's more helpful to say, we have gender neutral washrooms. We have done education with our frontline staff to ensure that we're sort of reducing transphobia and homophobic barriers. These are things that those of us who are used to experiencing harm when we go to spaces can see as signs that this is not just a hopeful assertion, but that actually something has changed that means that that space may now actually be welcoming for us. And similarly, one thing that's really hard to do as an organization is also state the barriers that you haven't yet dealt with. So being able to say that these spaces, for example, are not yet wheelchair accessible. And ideally, we're working on changing this in these ways, because what's actually most harmful for folks like me getting involved is if I show up 3 times to things that are supposed to be accessible and aren't, I'm just gonna stop trying. I think that's a big reason why many of us don't end up in these spaces, is we've had so many negative experiences when we've been told something will be inclusive, that we actually stop trusting that anything will ever be inclusive.
All right, thank you so much for that clarification. One of the other questions is, again, about specific strategies. And I think it's interesting how the same form or a different form of the same question keeps coming up. What should we do? Where should we start? How can we do this? And so it seems like people are really hungry for this knowledge and yet feeling a bit lost still. And so some of the things that we covered in the session, specifically around your staff and who's making the decisions, I think that's a really important first step, and certainly something that at least the managers or those who are responsible for hiring, who are on the seminar, on the webinar, will have control over. And so, look at your kind of work. What do you do? Are you responsible for programming? Are you responsible for bringing staff in? Are you responsible for making posters? What kind of work do you do? And then for me, I think one of the starting points would be, how can my specific work be more inclusive rather than, thinking of the whole organization or the whole problem of colonialism, right? So looking really specifically at your kind of labor and what you might do as a specific way, and how you can be held accountable. Yes, how you can be held accountable is by incorporating it into the policies, right? What are you mandated to do? And if you have taken an initiative, you have created some change and you've seen some positive outcomes, make sure people know about it. And so then that will encourage others to follow suit. There's a question from Carrie Hollywood asking, does the panel ever feel that an organization's hiring process is a process that should be evaluated because of their structured interview questions? We care to do it right. I'm so happy to hear that, Carrie. Would Donnie or Tricia, would either of you like to take this question? Everyone's being so polite. Go ahead, Tricia.
Thanks, Bonnie, but I'll quickly throw it over to you if you don't mind. Yeah, just to say that I think that's a great idea in terms of creating and looking at a specific policy to see how it may be working or how it may not be working, and also to think about how your policy around hiring could be more inclusive or to break down barriers. I'm not myself, I'm not too familiar with that type of an approach to jobs and advertisements, but I know that is a specific an example of where some changes can be made. Donnie?
Thanks. You're right on track there. And I would go a little bit further, Carrie Hollywood, great name, to say that not only should we be evaluating them, we should be challenging them. I think they're rooted in very old practices, often, not everybody. So HR practitioners out there know that I respect you doing your work, but often they're rooted in very white, cis male thinking, because that's where they started from. So challenge them in terms of even ageism. Are we looking at any sort of restriction, and why can't we be a little more creative? Why can't we reach out to different audiences? I'll tell you that I was involved in it was a conversation about why we don't have more women working in parks. And a real simple answer came out. It was so fascinating. And there's a lot of things to that. But one of the things was, we don't actually advertise for intro or for entry-level positions in places where we would necessarily be looking specifically for women to be looking at that. We don't actively go out and try to get women involved in parks operations. And you kind of have to do it actively. You can't just wait for it to happen.
Yeah, and the interview process, it's designed to be meritocratic, right? It's supposed to be fair and that the most qualified person will get the job. But when those characteristics of qualifications are already skewed from the beginning, then you're going to end up with the staff teams that you have. So we really need to think about, what qualities are we looking for, and then how might we ask questions that will elicit whether these candidates actually have the, for example, the equity, diversity, inclusion competencies that we're really looking for. And if none of them have it, then start the search over. And I know sometimes there are pressures from the organization, there are event pressures, you know, we need to get someone quickly, and hiring processes can't always be protracted, but that's part of the colonial capitalist productivity machine also that we are wrapped up in, that demands that we rush through things that really require care and time. So I'm so happy to see the phrase, we care to do it right. And if that is the case, then take your time. Danielle, would you like to add to that?
Just one very quick thing that I think it's helpful also to notice the difference between someone having experience and having knowledge. And so experience is important. We want our community to represent the wide range of people in the larger community, but also we can actually specifically hire for knowledge. So we can ask questions like, hey, here's some information about our organization. One of the questions we can ask people is, how should we change it? Like, we can actually be hiring for disruption. We can hire for people who have this knowledge specifically. So, suggestion.
That's great. Thank you for that. There's another question about addressing the defensiveness so that people are in a place to be open to understanding and change. And I recognize this is a common issue. This question is from Erin. Would any of the panelists like to tackle this one? What tips do you have for addressing defensiveness?
I think this is a really pertinent question, because I think when we start talking about these systems of harm, settler colonialism, the ongoing impacts of it, and everyday realities of violence that Indigenous peoples and others experience, a lot of defensiveness will come up out of that, because we weren't trained to think about the system as being the problem. And so I think just turning to those resources that help people get the vocabulary and gain the awareness around what to expect when talking about anti-racist struggles will help give you that knowledge to counteract it when it happens. And I think just to be welcome to the discomfort. You know, I'm a teacher in the Faculty of Education, and I'm teaching the next generation of teachers to teach about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people's perspectives in their classrooms. And so I handle a lot of discomfort in my classrooms when I'm teaching the next generation of teachers. And how I like to handle it in the classroom is to welcome it. I don't say that we're going to create a safe space in my classroom. I say we're going to create a space that we're going to be brave. We're going to have uncomfortable conversations. We're going to have difficult conversations, and it's okay to disagree with each other, so long as that we are hearing each other. And so I think taking a disarming effect when we're talking about these structures that create harm is part of it. But also when it's coming from an Indigenous person, or when it's coming from a Black person, or someone who experiences these harms on a daily basis, to allow them to share their stories without asking them to justify it, to just listen first and foremost, and do your own learning on your own time. Don't expect them to teach you in that moment when they're voicing their own concerns. And there's many resources out there that touches on this. The first that comes to mind is Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. She goes through in her book about how to deal with the white fragility that comes up in different spaces as discomfort and defensiveness.
Absolutely. A few other characteristics are white tears, white guilt. And so, you know, I think some of that defensiveness is because rather than hearing what the person is saying, the mind instantly goes to me and my experiences, and I didn't do that, and I'm not responsible for the injustices of history. And so rather than focusing on the self, if you're the person who is feeling defensive, I think it's important to move towards, as Tricia said, openness, listening, and then processing later, and even just recognizing those defensive feelings, you know. And this happens, I think, also to people of color when we're talking about issues of disability, or it happens to straight people when we're talking about LGBTQ2SI plus inclusion. And so all of us are living with some privileges and some oppressions. And so if you haven't lived in the other person's experience, then you're not expected to know what that is, but you are expected to be an open listener and then do the work on your own time to unpack, wow, why did I feel like this? Feel like that? Why did I feel that I needed to shut down that conversation? Erin says that a comment came from Sean Ferguson. Perhaps this one can go to Donnie if you want to address it. Interesting. I think HR is primarily female oriented and hiring females more than males, and especially in Parks and Recreation on the programming side. The operational side is still primarily male dominated. I'm interested in why City of Vancouver has such bad data on this. It's evident as an applicant candidate and applying to jobs that the industry, and specifically what CPRA governs, is female driven. And that's how they hire. It's not inclusive to males, or not highly qualified and experienced males. So it's a very specific question, but I wonder, Donnie, if you might have some insights on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. My comment wasn't necessarily about Vancouver. Just for the record, I've been the general manager in Vancouver now I'm on week 3. So while I have worked here before, this isn't a Vancouver reflection. When you look back to municipal government, women didn't actually join that working sector until we were fairly well established, even in Parks and Rec. So while recreation, I would say, especially in recreation and in the programming, not the operation, there is a large groundswell of women. I don't think I don't think that addresses the question about where the questions come from, where they're rooted from, how they're rooted with, we should be evaluating, are there micro racist things that exist within even our questions, even our process. We have learned that if we want to hire people who have Indigenous background, going through our regular channels that we always go through, that's not going to work for us. So when I say that, it's more about taking a look and challenging your current processes to see where there might be places that aren't accessible for everybody, not just women.
Thank you for that, Donnie. And we have another question from Layla. As a parent of a girl with a disability, what do you suggest a parent can do in terms of sport and involvement? Go ahead, Donnie.
May I start with that one? And I know that my teammates here will answer, but hi, Layla. I'm sure I know Layla. I would say get involved in your sport council, get involved with the sport community, because again, it's another community that can be rooted. If I look back to my history, who was opening the door on my bench? It was the dad. It was my dad. It was, everybody in hockey. It was the dads who came out and coached. That's changed an awful lot. And intentionally, we have more women involved in sport. But I would say the way to do that is to step up and be the one. Just because you aren't qualified necessarily to be a coach in some sports, like little kids sport, quite honestly, I would challenge that and say, I didn't know anything about soccer, but I coached my son's soccer because it was me or some other person who had as little experience as I did, but I at least worked in recreation. I at least had a passion for it. So don't question that you might actually have the ability to step up and be a coach or be on the board. Make that change. So thank you. Sorry, I was passionate about that one.
We love passion around here. Go ahead, Danielle.
On one hand, I totally agree. And on the other hand, I'm going to introduce some tension because I can say as someone with a disability or as a parent with a child with a disability, you're probably already doing about 10 times more labor just to access transportation, just to access school, just to access friends, just to access the most basic things that other people take for granted. And so often we don't have the extra time to be doing those things. And when we go into those programs, I will say you will get shut down 99.9 times before even one organization even suggests a disabled person could be involved. And I'll say this is one of the problems around disability, and particularly a gendered experience of disability in Canada and racialized gender experience of disability in Canada, is that the information about how to get involved is very hidden. I actually did a research project on this, and over 90% of organizations that are paid by the government to run disability programs, some of which do, don't have a single thing on their websites that they actually run programs that are open to disabled people. So for you specifically, Layla, I'd be very happy, depending on the nature of the impairment and where you are, to connect you with someone who can get you involved. If you're in BC, BC Wheelchair Sports is one of the best organizations, I think, in Canada. And if that is not the form of impairment, they will at least know who to connect you with. If you're elsewhere, you feel free to contact me through the moderators or whatever. I'm happy to support you getting connected. But this is precisely the problem. Getting involved if you have a disability in Canada is a secret. You have to have the secret handshakes and the secret people, and we need to change that.
Thanks so much, Danielle. I think there's a lot of public attention, media attention. Maybe let me rephrase, maybe not a lot, but people's attention around adaptive sport or disabled sport is parasport, right? It's at a national level, and the fact that we have the Olympics and the Paralympics, people might assume that there are lots of opportunities for that kind of involvement. And I think just as the national teams are only a very small sliver of who's participating in sport across the nation, certainly parasport, I think that's even more exaggerated, right? And so the numbers of people who want to play at recreational levels, at grassroots levels, are not being provided with those same opportunities. So thank you. If you know some of the secret handshakes, it would be great if we could pass those along. I wonder, are there any questions, or is there anything that I missed from the chat? Any further questions? I'll jump in.
I don't see any other questions.
Okay.
But maybe we'll just give people an opportunity, another minute or so, if you want to type in anything. Some great questions, and I agree. Lots of people really interested in where do we start? Where do we start this journey? I think there's great interest, and I think that's really positive. It's a great start for sure. Lots of people, I was going to say, it wasn't so much a question, but a lot of people thanking the panel for their great insight. I did also want to mention, one question came up around, will some links be available for resources that the panelists have talked about? And yes, we will definitely make sure that we can track down any of those resources and make them available. I'll also mention right now that for those who want to watch the video in its entirety, so as you know, we pre-taped part of it, and now the question and answer is live. The whole thing will be together. If you'd like to, again, watch it in its entirety or share it with any of your colleagues, you will be able to download it from the CPRA website at www.cpra.ca. And we also have the new community of practice that I mentioned, the bench, and it will also be available there. You can reach the bench through the CPRA website as well.
Go ahead, Donnie.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something of interest to me that's come out is that just by participating in this panel, and I'm participating in a couple of other panels, just by having these conversations, it actually ignites something in me to take more action. And I'm hoping that it ignites something in others just to take a little bit of action, just to, like a little bit, because it's not this overwhelming thing. And I think back to when I was, I was a rec programmer or a teen and senior program, or I went on to run a community center. I was able to make minor adjustments that in the end, others picked up on it. And it then became a cascading effect that other people were part of my internal activist journey, is how I like to refer to it. As people who work in government, we can't necessarily take a political stance or an activist stance, but we can do that. We can be internal activists for the good. And so I think that's very rewarding, but you can do it at any level within Parks and Recreation and from any seat. And I think that's the important thing, is just start.
Yeah, absolutely. What is your sphere of influence? What is your role? And start there. There's a question from Tara Chisholm about what do you believe are the benefits to running girls or women's only programming? Are there any consequences or negatives to this? And I will add that, you know, when it's called a women or girls program, we might assume that 50% of the population knows that they are invited. And that is just simply not the case. And so, as Danielle was saying about the kinds of access points that you are able to provide or that you are still working on, you need to be really explicit about this. There are many racialized communities that will understand that if it's a girls' soccer program, that means it's going to be mostly white girls. It's going to be mostly skinny white girls with blonde hair and ponytails, and they are not going to be friendly or inclusive. And the list goes on, as we've been talking about in this panel around intersectional identities and the ways that we need to do more than say girls and women. Even, you know, just starting with the gender spectrum, who is really included when you are saying that this is a girls or women's program, and then also thinking about the other layers. And what work have you done to ensure that this is not a racist space, so that when Somali girls show up with their hijab, they are not going to automatically feel that not only is this particular program for them, but maybe sport is not for them, or maybe this town is not for them. You know, the implications of what happens on the sports field are very far-reaching. Would any other panelists like to add to that about maybe some of the consequences of girls-only programming?
I'll quickly weigh in if that's okay. This same question is often asked around disability only programming, like do we do segregated or do we do integrated? And what I sort of like to say, if we look at the things that most people do in their daily life, they do some things that are segregated around religious identity, some around gender, some around age, some around people who are genetically included, related to them. That we do this all the time, that we have particular activities where different parts of ourselves get to come forward. So I'm a huge fan of not having everything be segregated all the time. I'm a huge fan of choice, that there should be spaces where we don't have to be the only girl. I was the only girl at the time playing in a professional league in Europe, and it was a lot of work and it was hard and there were a lot of microaggressions and it was worth it, but also having opportunities where I didn't have to deal with that made it safe for me. So I'm a big fan of having a wide range of opportunities, some of which different parts of ourselves get to feel more affirmed.
Thank you, Danielle. And a question from Erin. Have any of you incentivized community partners to improve their practices, prioritize rec facility access or funding programs for clubs or programs that are more inclusive or gender balanced? Incentivization. Donnie, would you mind taking this question?
I think it's an amazing idea. I happen to know that because the person who's asking it, Erin, who works with me on projects, that this is something that we're tackling we're grappling with right now. Going into the sport community where you're actually just influencing is challenging. So trying to get the sport community on board with creating policy that then incentivizes these policies. It has to be a collaborative approach. I worked in a smaller municipality, and some of the leaders in the sport organizations and the coordinated groups of sport organizations decided that equity was important, and they stood back and talked to each other about, well, what kinds of policy can we agree to help the city create policy that will move this agenda forward. So first you have to have the philosophy. And I think that it's the right way to go. Get to the root of it. Don't create another barrier. Go work with the folks using the sport facilities to share those values, I think, with us.
That's great. And then everyone can be on the same page. I really like that. Thanks. And Erin has mentioned the funding opportunity at womenandgirlsinrecsport.ca. I encourage everyone to check that out at your earliest convenience. Are there any other questions?
I don't think I see any others, Janelle. So maybe what I'll do then is I'll wrap us up. I want to again thank all four of the presenters today on behalf of CPRA for your wisdom, I found it educational, I found it thought-provoking, and even emotional. I'm excited about the ways that CPRA can continue to move the work forward. And I was madly taking notes as you all are all right, we're all speaking, but knowing that I can watch the video over and over again as well. We are currently embarking actually on a journey of truth and reconciliation and looking at racism, but there's so much more that we can do. And certainly trying to do that through some of the different programs that we are involved with now. So really also want to thank you for your comments about the fact that people want to make sure that they and we are addressing equity and inclusion, but we don't always know how. We don't always have the right language. We don't always have the knowledge to move forward. So I thank you for giving us a really great start today. And again, it is just a start as we all, I think from a CPRA perspective, move forward. And I think those who joined us today on the call will certainly also think about or have some concrete ways that they can move things forward in their organizations. So again, I want to thank you. I mentioned that you can get the video on cpra.ca. We do have the new fund available. That thank you, Janelle, for mentioning that again. And heartfelt thanks to all of you for your time today, to our amazing speakers, and to those of you watching on Zoom. So thank you. We'll hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.